In this session, we're going to look at the EventSentry installation process. This process is actually divided into two parts that run in sequence. The first part is the EventSentry installer. So that's the traditional installer that you'd be used to when you install any sort of software on your Windows system. Whereas the second part is an application that we developed that runs after installation and actually sets up and pre-configures EventSentry. So when you download the EventSentry installer, and the configuration assistant is included in the EventSentry installer. So this is not a separate application that you have to download. It's included in the installer and it's launched automatically. So when you launch the EventSentry installer will be copying files. It will set up the base configuration, sort of the template that is the default for any EventSentry installation. The EventSentry installer will handle upgrades and patches. So if you're upgrading to a higher version, for example, from 5.0 to 5.1, it will detect that, or from even earlier versions, or if you're just patching an existing 5.0 or 5.1 installation, for example. The EventSentry installer will also install the built-in database and also install and download the EventSentry web reports. So it sort of does the blunt of the work, copying the files and setting everything up. So once all of that is complete, the installer will finish and will launch the configuration assistant. The only exception is a patch. And you're running a patch, then the configuration assistant will not run. Instead, the installer will finish and you're essentially done. The configuration assistant will start by asking you questions about email, addresses, mail server, which components you want to actually configure and enable. It will create or update the existing database schema. So in newer versions, major versions, there's usually changes to the schema, new features are being added, existing features are tweaked. And that means that the table structure on the database will have to be adjusted. So if it's a new installation, it will obviously create the schema from scratch. And if you're upgrading to a new version, it will just update the schema. And then it will finalize the installation by starting services, setting certain registry values, and so forth. So now that we have a brief, a general understanding of the installation process, let's actually start and walk through the EventSentry installation, the first step. So running just the installer. So let's look at the actual installation process. I downloaded all the files, and you usually end up with two files, one being the main installer, which is indicated just by the name EventSentry, the version number, and then it's a Windows setup. And then we have the web reports installer, which I pre-downloaded, which has the same exact name, except it includes the words web reports, and they're easily distinguishable by with the different icons. If the web reports installer exists in the same directory as the main installer, then the main installer will not attempt to download the web reports, which it usually does, and just run the installation of the web reports from the current directory. So this is especially important and useful if you have an offline installation that doesn't have access to the internet, in which case you want to make sure that the web reports installer is in the same directory, and then we'll seamlessly install it in the background. So let's start. This is a warning message that we can ignore at this point. This is an internal revision of the installer that hasn't been officially published. So we're getting a warning message here that the checksum for the installer could not be found. You should normally not get this message. So if you get this message, you may want to try to download the file again or contact our support team. Normally we'll get an informational message here that says that the checksum was verified successfully. So we're just going to hit next here. We're going to accept the license agreement. We're picking the installation directory. We're going to go with the default here, and we're going to be picking the components. We're going to be picking all of the components here, the help, the built-in database, as well as the web reports. Next, we're being asked where the EventSentry database will actually be located. So the database files. If you have a larger disk drive, then you can point the directory here, to a different drive. But by default, the database is stored in the data 14 directory. It's also asking us if we should create a firewall rule to allow database traffic into the computer. Since we are going to be using the collector and running all services locally, we're going to decline this, and we're not going to create a firewall rule, which will enhance security. We're now being asked for the admin password, so that's important to remember that. That's going to be the password you'll use to access the actual database server. Since the web reports are being installed, it's asking us which port they'll be running on. I'm going to stick with the default of 8080. And in this case, obviously, you want to create a firewall rule to allow this web traffic so that so that you can access the web reports from remote machines. And that's it. Now we're just going to hit next. So this process does take a little while, depending on the hardware, the speed of the machine that you're running this on. In most cases, it should take around 5 minutes or so. But if you're on a slower machine, like a VM machine or so forth, it could take longer than that. So this is where we arrive when the installation is finished. So the first part, that is, of the installation is finished. And once we hit the finish button here, as explained earlier, the configuration assistant will now load, and we'll start with the second part of the installation to complete the customization of EventSentry.